Thank you very much. It is my delight and pleasure to introduce our next panelist and next member of our Fireside Chat. As we learned yesterday, innovation happens everywhere. This forum on innovation, we think about where ideas start. Ideas start in the laboratories, at the Massachusetts General Hospital, at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, at Dana-Farber, at Boston Children's, at Beth Israel. That's where ideas start. They're nurtured and developed by some of the best biotech companies in the world, which are located here in Boston and others throughout the country. And often, they take form in products which are made by some of the best big pharma companies that bring medicines to patients in broad markets. And I am delighted to be able to introduce the CEO of one of the big pharma companies who has chosen to move a significant portion of research and development to Boston. And that's Dr. Giovanni Caforio of Bristol-Myers Squibb. Giovanni received his MD from the University of Rome. He's a physician with extensive experience in the industry. He began his career at Abbott in Europe and joined BMS in 2000 in the division in Italy and ran the business in Italy. He eventually became involved in oncology and understands the oncology market, understands the importance of bringing new drugs to patients, and certainly understands the unmet medical need that still exists for many patients with common cancers throughout the world. Giovanni became president of the U.S. Oncology Division, eventually president of U.S., and became chief commercial officer of Bristol-Myers in 2013. And in 2015, May of 2015, he was named the chief executive officer of Bristol-Myers Squibb. I've had the pleasure of serving on Giovanni's board, and I have watched him lead and guide the company with a keen eye, again, looking for innovation, looking for value, and looking for ways to bring better drugs to our patients, better products to our patients, to deliver on the promise of what Commissioner Slawa just said, the importance of bringing new medicines to patients that make a difference. Giovanni.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Meg. I'll actually keep my comments really short because I look forward to the Q&A and the dialogue. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. It is a really important time, and actually, from my perspective, we've never been closer to finding really meaningful and important cures for patients with many types of cancers. And I'd like to comment very briefly on three topics. The importance of keeping the patient at the center, the importance of following the science, and the critical role of partnerships and collaborations between the industry and the academic community, because I believe that those three areas are absolutely central to the work that we are doing at Bristol-Myers Squibb in immuno-oncology and the reason why we've been successful. So a few months ago, with my leadership team, we met a young woman, a 31-year-old Indian actress, very successful, and she came to tell us that 6 years ago she'd been diagnosed with Hodgkin lymphoma. And she told us everything about the progression of the disease, pain and suffering, and how she didn't respond to the first 5 lines of therapy. And then 5 years later, she was enrolled in a clinical trial with one of our immuno-oncology medicines, and she had an 80% regression, and she started acting again. But the interesting thing is that beyond actually coming to thank us, she reminded us that she was in an 80% remission, not in 100% remission. And as a result of that, we needed to keep going and keep working and fighting to continue to take science forward because we were not done. And I think it's a really important story because as much as we are proud of the progress we've made as an industry in academia and everywhere in healthcare, there is a lot that is left to be done. So I think that's really the number one concept. The second concept is that it's really important to follow the science. And many years ago, when we were beginning to work on one of our immuno-oncology molecules, the first one, we did a lot of work to recognize that patients that were apparently progressing were in fact responders. But the way the immune system works, there was an inflammation at the tumor site, and there were apparent progressions, but those patients were actually responding. And so we had to do a lot of work with many of you to change response criteria and really understand the science. And we were able to design the right clinical trials, and in fact, fast forward a few years, last year, Opdivo had 5 phase 3 clinical trials that were all stopped early because of overall survival. And that's really, again, a demonstration of the importance of working together and following the science. And the third point that I would like to make, it is all about working together and collaborating. And for us at Bristol-Myers Squibb, at the beginning, it was the partnership with Moderator that we eventually acquired. But through this journey, we have created an international immuno-oncology network with key academic institutions around the world that work with us on basic science and translational medicine. And we've really contributed to advancing the science together. We decided to create a network of community-based oncologists because we recognized the importance of educating treating physicians on a very new modality in cancer care, and we wanted to make sure that investigator-sponsored clinical research moved earlier into the community with new products. Now we are continuing to work with academia across the board, but also we've partnered and continue to partner effectively with the biotech industry. So the 3 points really about patient centricity, following the science, and collaboration have been absolutely critical to the interesting journey, the exciting journey we've had becoming a leading company in immuno-oncology and taking the science forward. And those principles continue to be at the core of our strategy going forward. We are extremely focused on advancing combinations of immunotherapy in oncology because we believe that they can offer the hope for long-term survival for many more patients with good quality of life. We have one of those regimens approved, and we are taking that same regimen across multiple types of tumors, but also we've invested again in collaboration with the academic world and the biotech industry in 8 new molecules in early development in order to continue to move the science forward. And I want to close by saying that one of the comments that our patients said to us was to make sure that our medicines were affordable and that our clinical trials and our medicines reach a broad population of patients around the world. And access to our clinical trials is really central to our strategy in immuno-oncology, but also access commercially for medicines that have been approved is something we focus on very clearly as a priority. So this is an exciting time. I think about it not only in terms of all of the patients we're helping already because of all the work we're doing together. I think about it primarily because of all of the patients that we are not helping yet, because clearly a lot remains to be done. Thank you.
Well, that was fascinating, as you can see by all of my note-taking on all of your comments. Can you start by pronouncing your name for us?
Giovanni.
And your last
Caforio.
name? I just love it. Okay. I want to start by actually going back to how you got into medicine. Tell us about your history, how you got into this field in the first place.
So, for me, when I think about it, it's the telephone calls from patients calling my dad, who was a physician, during lunchtime and dinner time at home, because I don't think I was ever really told my parents, you have to be a physician because your dad is and and many people in your family are. But I think it was in the water and in the air because, again, I remember so many stories, and in many ways, they became part of our family life as much as they were part of my dad's profession. So I think it's one of the reasons why I have such a clear focus on patients.
And so you did become a physician. How long did you practice before then moving over to industry?
I actually moved to the industry and to R&D right away because I was in an oncology unit as I completed medical school, and those were the days many, many years ago in which good clinical practices were really beginning to take hold, and I felt that I wanted to be involved with developing new medicines, and And I also felt that it was really good to learn how to do clinical trials in the industry. And so I decided to go and work for a pharmaceutical company for 1 year before going back to the hospital. But obviously, 28 years later, I'm still here.
What was it about industry that appealed to you, that kept you there versus going back and being a doctor?
You know, I've never felt I was further away from patients because of the work I've done than for many of you that are practicing physicians and researchers. You're very close to patients in different ways, but the ability to see the full scope of activities from discovering to developing medicines and delivering medicines to patients, I think it's fascinating, and I've really enjoyed it, and I continue to do it every day.
So let's talk about Opdivo, because it's such an exciting drug. Where would you say we are in this sort of revolution of immunotherapy with Opdivo on the market and all the places where it is and all the patients it's treated, but how much further can we go?
Yeah, you know, Meg, I think it's really interesting because you can and we can step back and look at the last 18 months, and it's been an extraordinary story. Because, you know, if you think about a new medicine with a very different mechanism of action that is approved with 5 new indications in 3 tumor types, lung cancer, melanoma, kidney cancer, all phase 3 clinical studies, overall survival, in a period of a little over 12 months, it's an extraordinary progress. And I always remember a few years ago when we were working on ipilimumab, on Yervoy, and we were really excited about being able to offer a hope to patients with metastatic melanoma, because in those days you had a 10 to 15% probability of being alive 1 year after diagnosis with stage 4 melanoma. You know, we recently presented data with our combination regimen, patients after 2 years, 69% overall survival. It doesn't really happen very often to make such a big leap in a period of 5 to 6 years. Now, the way I like to think about it, though, is that we are just at the beginning. And that makes it even more exciting, because it is about taking the promise of immuno-oncology and clearly a product like Opdivo to tumors that were not easy to treat before, like head and neck cancer and Hodgkin lymphoma. It's investigating the potential of combination immuno-oncology therapies, and also the many different modalities that we are investigating. The tumor microenvironment, I guess, was a concept that many of us didn't even know about a few years ago. And now we have targets we're working against, and we are advancing medicines into early development, which is really exciting. So it's you know, a source of pride to be associated with Opdivo, and at the same time it's a very big responsibility to be continuing to take the science forward.
Tell us about the development path for Opdivo. At what point did you and your scientists, and I guess you were collaborating with an outside company at the time, so how did that work, and what decisions as CEO did you have to make to put your resources there at the expense of maybe other things?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you about how we looked at it. Obviously, I wasn't CEO at that time. The way we thought about it is, first of all, in our case, there was a really strong confluence of our deep knowledge in oncology for many years and our focus on immunology. Because at the end, immuno-oncology really requires a deep understanding of the immune system at the same time as you really understand cancer. And I think that for Bristol-Myers Squibb, in the partnership with Medrex, there was always a strong fit from a science perspective. The second thing is that we recognized it was a very high-risk approach, because in fact, many of you, I'm sure, will remember there was a lot of skepticism a few years ago with respect to immuno-oncology. And when you went to ASCO just a few years ago, the immuno-oncology team, you know, the immuno-oncology experts were typically not in the biggest room and were typically not where the most public was in those sessions. So what we understood is that you know, there were high probability that our approach wouldn't work, but if it did, it would be transformational. And that's why we decided to push the button and go ahead, because because the potential transformational effect to patients was understood from the very beginning and was very significant. And I think that was a really good lesson, because if you really focus on game changers, it may not work very often, but when it does, it makes a really big difference for patients. And so the only other thing that I would say that I'm really proud of is that BMS acquired Moderator eventually, and we have been leading that program for many years. But I was at our Redwood City facility, which was the original Moderator site, just last week. 95% of the people, of the scientists that were working for Moderator originally and were there at the time of our acquisition are still there. And the size of that site has increased by threefold. But I would say that culturally and from the perspective of their focus on science, they would tell you that not very much has changed. And I think that's really, really important.
How do you make sure you're giving the right resources to something that can be a game changer, while at the same time making sure you're diversified enough so that if that fails, you don't crater, essentially?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really good point, and it's one of the big priorities for us even now, because we obviously have a very clear focus on oncology as a priority therapeutic area for the company. But at the same time, we have committed to continue to invest in areas where we think we have leading science and we can diversify our portfolio. So that's a really important trade-off that we have to make every day. And the way we do it is by having clearly a focus on science and allowing the scientists at the company to really tell us what the best path forward is. But at the same time, I think we have a fairly disciplined process in the company that enables us to make the right decisions and progress programs stepwise, so that we are sure that we're always progressing the most meaningful programs and the most promising programs we have in our pipeline. I think it's one of the reasons why our R&D organization has been so productive.
Well, tell us about these 8 new molecules you have in early development. What are some of the most exciting new approaches you're working on there?
So 2 things there. The first one is, obviously, when you look at the combination of Yervoy and Opdivo, and what I mentioned before, the bar is very high. And so we are focusing the majority of our efforts with new combinations on patients that don't respond to the currently available immuno-oncology agents, to patients that may be progressing rapidly after an initial response, and on those tumors where we have not yet seen major progress with PD-1 and CTLA-4. Those are really the 3 areas in which we're focused. I'm really excited that we are beginning to understand more and more. And so, the role of the microenvironment, for example, around the tumor in influencing the way an immune response can attack the tumor, I believe from a scientific perspective, clearly from my point of view, we are just at the beginning of understanding that, but we've broadened our portfolio to include some really interesting targets that impact the tumor microenvironment.
How early stage are those, and is that sort of indicative of the way you look to do partnerships?
Many of them are early, and we have done a lot of partnerships in this area. They have tended to be early because, again, the science is so recent here. But I would say that we need to be thinking very differently about the traditional approach of doing phase 1 and then phase 2 and then phase 3 and progressing very longitudinally. Because at the speed at which science is moving, in many ways, when we combine a new agent with Opdivo, we are doing a phase 3 experiment at the same time as we're doing an early development experiment. And the area in which we are investing the most is clearly translational research, because you could imagine that if you have 3 approved immuno-oncology agents and 8 in development, and you're thinking about combination, you can do the math yourself. The number of potential combinations is just extraordinary, and so we can't progress 8 to the 8th combinations through traditional clinical development. We need to be able to recognize through early models the most promising signals, to be very tailored in the way we advance our early pipeline.
How do you do that exactly? When you say translational research, what do you mean exactly?
Well, I think that we are working. I mentioned earlier our immuno-oncology, international immuno-oncology network. That's really a network that involves some of the academic institutions and research centers around the world that are focused on immuno-oncology. They are doing a lot of basic research with us to really understand what happens in the tumor microenvironment. They're helping us develop animal models that can predict responses. We are going back and analyzing very large banks of tissue samples and blood samples to understand what happened in many patients that were treated in previous clinical trials, to understand whether our hypothesis can be confirmed. And so obviously this is a room full of scientists. They're much more knowledgeable than me. But the idea is to have a deeper understanding of how science correlates with clinical findings in order to move in a much more targeted way into the expensive phases of clinical development.
Could you talk a little bit about the way you approach partnerships with smaller biotechs versus academia? What do you look for in each of those different partners?
Well, we have a very long history of partnerships, and in fact, when you look at them, the most important medicines in the history of the company, really many of them were partnered early and developed together. And what we look for is a really strong collaboration from a scientific perspective. And we approach partnerships from the perspective that the two companies together will be able to accelerate a program better and faster than any of the two companies would do it on their own. There are clearly complexities in any partnership. It is complex to work between the industry and academia. It is very complex to work between a very small biotech company and a very large company. But we try to let the scientists, to the extent that we can, create the right collaborative environment to advance science together. Obviously, when a partnership becomes bigger, we have invested in developing alliance management capabilities and all that is needed for the machine to work effectively. But I think it starts with having respect from a science perspective and being open to the contributions of the other company.
Well, we talked about this a lot with our conversation with Andy, but how do you look at price right now? And as you're combining these drugs, are you looking at alternative models of how these things get priced and how they will probably be paid for?
Yeah, we definitely look at it all the time because at the end, if a new medicine doesn't reach a patient because of an access barrier, it's not going to generate a positive outcome. And so we look at it as a priority. And I actually agree that the increasing cost of healthcare is an issue that requires a lot of attention. As a leader in this field, we are already working very actively with regulators, with payers, with providers to understand how we can continue to improve access to our medicines. And the issue of combinations, it's actually a really important issue. So the first thing we do is, I think it's really important that we work together, because my perspective is medicines are 10% of the cost. That percentage, is really remained constant for many years. If we don't work on the 100%, we will never be able to have an impact, including the 10%. So we try to work together, and I think it's really important to work together. We're also open to different payment models, and in fact, I think we need more flexibility in the system, because we should be able to think about different indications differently. We should be able to combine two medicines and have different pricing mechanisms for combination. Our system at this point in the US is fairly rigid. We are very open to more flexibility in the system, and I'm convinced it's about working together.
One thing a lot of folks wonder about is basically that every player will have to own every piece of a combination in order to figure out these new pricing models, because otherwise let's say you were going to partner with another company and they had their own $100,000 a year drug, yours is $100,000 a year. How do you guys decide how to combine that and maybe take less for each one? Do you agree that you have to have every portion of a combo in-house under this new era of pricing cancer combos?
So I think that having both medicines in a combination regimen is obviously a big advantage from many points of view, because you can develop them together faster, you understand both of them, you know how to combine them, and it is much easier to do the clinical trials. Eventually, when you get to market, it clearly enables you to have a much better discussion with a payer, and hopefully in the future to price the regimen instead of both molecules independently. I think clearly there is a big advantage, and when you look at Opdivo and Yervo in the marketplace today, clearly we know that physicians understand both medicines. They're familiar with both of them. They're combining them effectively already in melanoma. It is important for us to be able to discuss the full regimen. Having said that, I think it would be a mistake if we focus our research effort entirely on the assumption that you have to have both molecules, because I think we need to be looking at science first. And if the best combination is one that requires two companies to work together, I think we want to work on the best combination as well. So it's not a one-size-fits-all, and I think we need to look at both.
How do you think about biomarkers as an important tool in your drug development?
I think about it as a really important tool, and I remember a few years ago when we were discussing the concept of immuno-oncology externally, a lot of people told us we were somewhat going against the wave of personalized medicine and targeted medicine, because immuno-oncology is a much broader concept. And as a result of that, from the beginning, we have focused on a very solid biomarker program associated with every one of our clinical trials. Right now, I think our ability to identify a really meaningful biomarker is probably at the beginning. But eventually, particularly if you think about so many immuno-oncology agents going through development, there will be an element of immuno-oncology which becomes very targeted. If we understand why a patient may not be responding to Opdivo or may be progressing, we may be able to identify those patients up front and target a different therapeutic approach for those patients. So I think as the science of immuno-oncology becomes even more understood and more mature, there will be segmentation, and biomarkers will begin to be even more important than they are already today.
How would you characterize our understanding, or how close we are to understanding why patients don't respond to immunotherapy?
I think we're just at the beginning, Meg. I think we really are. It doesn't mean we won't move very quickly, but I believe we are just at the beginning.
I think because a lot of people kind of see these wonderful things happening in immunotherapy, and they say, well, why not me? I mean, have you identified sort of partners out there or academic groups that are really focused on this? I mean, does it seem like an area of really fruitful research?
Well, clearly there are a number of groups around the world that are focused on immuno-oncology for a long period of time. Obviously here, and in other parts of the country and many other countries around the world. And Tom mentioned at the beginning we made a decision to invest in a research facility here in Boston. We increased very significantly our presence in the Bay Area, because part of how you move quickly is proximity that enables cooperation between biotech, academia, and the industry. And so there are multiple sites around the world that are making great progress. And a few years ago in immuno-oncology, there was a lot of skepticism. Today, there is a lot of enthusiasm. That's providing great resources for those research organizations to be funded and to progress a lot of their work maybe more quickly than they were doing before.
In your opening remarks, you used the word cure. How do you think about cures in terms of cancer? What will that look like? What does that look like now in some cases?
Well, I think we always think about cure, and then we become a little concerned about whether you can ever really use the word cure in oncology. And I think that I was listening to one of the sessions this morning, and somebody mentioned that there are patients that were treated with Yervoy 10 years ago. You know, Yervoy is used with 4 doses over a 12-week period, and 10 years later are alive. So you could call those patients cured, and we know that the responses to immunotherapy with Opdivo, for example, are very long-lasting, and we have a lot of examples of patients that had just a relatively short course of therapy and has very, very deep responses that remain for a very long period of time. But I think we're also at the beginning of understanding when do you stop therapy, do you then re-challenge a patient that has progressed. The entire discussion about how long do you keep a patient in therapy after you've had a complete response, I don't think any of us has a really definitive answer right now.
Well, I think that's our time. Giovanni, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Meg. Thank you. Thanks.